412 failed calls. Idris Vane had counted everyone because counting was the only thing that made the 412 failures feel like anything other than proof that everyone at Grey Banner was right about him. The 413th call happened with 3 A-rank strikers already down, a fracture zone breach 6 seconds from swallowing the extraction line, and Captain Rurik Holt screaming an order Idris was never supposed to be close enough to hear directly. System Summoner Class Invocation Attempt 413. Nobody was watching Idris. That was the whole problem, and also, for 4 seconds, the only reason what happened next didn't get interrupted before it finished. He didn't summon an imp. He didn't summon anything the Hunter Registry had a name for. The air over the breach folded in on itself like something enormous was trying to fit through a door built for something small, and then it stopped trying and simply arrived. Bastion Croix's blade was already swinging, the reflex of a man who'd spent 3 years assuming anything that came out of Idris was a liability, not backup. It never landed. The shape that had folded itself out of the breach caught the strike between 2 fingers without turning to look at who'd thrown it, and set the blade down against the ash like it was returning something borrowed. The Voidkin closest to it didn't attack. They didn't flee either, they simply stopped, all at once, the way small things sometimes stop existing near something the world was never built to hold 2 of at the same time, and went still on the ash in a widening circle nobody in that breach would be able to explain in any incident report that used the word monster. Captain Holt stopped shouting mid-word. Every combat readout on his gauntlet, the ones that had never once returned a result for anything Idris had called, filled with a single line, repeating, refusing to resolve into a class or a threat rating or anything the registry had a category for. System, entity unregistered, classification failed, classification failed, classification failed. It knelt. Not to the breach. Not to Bastion, who'd swung at it and was still standing there with an empty weapon hand and no explanation for why he'd let it happen. It knelt in front of Idris Vane, the courtesy slot, the F-rank, the summoner whose whole file at Grey Banner Company was 3 lines long and ended with not recommended for field deployment, and it said a word none of them had a registry entry for either. Vessel. Nobody in that breach that night knew they weren't looking at a monster a trash summoner had gotten lucky calling. They were looking at the first 4 seconds of proof that the Hunter Registry had been wrong about Idris Vane since the day it ranked him, and wrong about what summoner meant for 200 years before that. Part 1, the courtesy slot 2, 30-24-30. System, class awakened summoner. 3 weeks before the breach, Idris Vane's trial marker had gone the same dull gray it always went for summoners, and the proctor hadn't even finished the readout before reaching for the next candidate's file. Summoner, the proctor said, the specific flat tone reserved for classes nobody in the hall considered worth a second look. Farming divisions through the West Corridor. Most guilds won't field slot a summoner unless you're covering utility contracts, pest clearing, resource runs. Manage your expectations. Idris didn't argue. Arguing with a proctor about a class ranking had never once changed a ranking, and he had exactly one thing on his mind walking out of that hall. Sella's trial was in 11 months, and trial-adjacent households got priority housing and guild-subsidized gear if at least one member held an active field contract. A farming division utility contract wasn't nothing. It also wasn't going to be enough, and he knew it before he finished the thought. The trial itself had taken 4 minutes, start to finish, long enough for the proctor to read his marker, long enough for the polite, disappointed silence Idris had already learned to recognize from 100 other candidates' faces before his own name was even called. He remembered walking out past the rows of benches lined with families waiting for their turn, remembered the specific weight of being 19 and already 3 years past the age most strikers awakened a usable class, remembered thinking, with the flat clarity of someone who'd expected this exact outcome and still felt it anyway, that at least it was over. Sella was waiting outside the trial hall's east gate, not because she'd been told the results yet, but because she always waited there, rain or clear sky, since the year their parents didn't come home from a routine zone contract 3 days after Idris's own 15th birthday. She read his face before he said a word. "Summoner," she said, not a question. "Summoner," he confirmed. She didn't say she was sorry, and she didn't say it didn't matter, both of which he'd have hated. What she said instead was the thing that had kept the two of them functioning as a household for 4 years running. "Okay. What's the plan?" The plan that evening, over dinner stretched further than it should have fed 2 people, was the same plan it had been since their parents' contract went unpaid on account of a guild that folded before settling its death benefits. Get a field contract, any field contract, because trial-adjacent households with an active-duty hunter, qualified for priority public housing and a subsidized gear allowance, the ordinary civilian rate didn't come close to matching. Sella's own trial was 11 months out. If Idris didn't have an active contract by then, her results, whatever they turned out to be, would land the two of them exactly where 4 years of careful budgeting had been trying not to land. On the open housing market at civilian rates, with a 16-year-old's trial gear bill due in full. "Farming division isn't nothing," Sella said, reading the number he hadn't said out loud yet. "It's not enough either," Idris said. "Not for both of us." She didn't argue with the math because the math was correct, and arguing with correct math had never been how the two of them solved a problem. What she did instead, the thing Idris didn't fully appreciate until months later, was start pulling every training log, every archived summoner casework, every fragment of public registry data she could get access to quietly in the background of ordinary teenage evenings, looking for an angle her brother's own exhaustion didn't leave him room to look for himself. Grey Banner Company took him on 2 weeks later, not because Captain Rurik Holt saw anything promising in his file, but because guild charters required a minimum roster diversity across class types to keep their registry accreditation, and a live-body summoner filled a box nobody else at Grey Banner wanted to fill. Holt said as much, not unkindly, in the 10-minute onboarding that was the only conversation the two of them had before Idris's first deployment. "You'll run support behind the line," Holt said, not looking up from the deployment board. "Crowd thinning if your summons can manage it. Nobody's expecting a summoner to swing the outcome of a breach response. Keep your head down, don't get in Bastion's way, and we'll have you home for dinner." Idris had heard some version of that sentence from every adult who'd ever had authority over him since his trial. He'd stopped expecting it to change. What he hadn't stopped doing, quietly, on his own time, in the small hours after Sella was asleep, was trying to understand why his calls kept failing, because none of the training manuals Grey Banner handed him described what actually happened when he reached for his class ability. The manuals described a straightforward exchange. Spend mana, open a small channel to the Voidkin pool a fracture zone generates, pull something through, control it for the duration of the summon. Idris had followed that exact procedure 412 times. 412 times, nothing came through the channel at all, not a weak imp, not a malformed half-thing, nothing. Just mana spent and silence on the other end, like he was knocking on a door that didn't lead anywhere the manual described. "Maybe you're just bad at it," Bastion said once, not cruelly, just the offhand honesty of a man who'd never had to consider the alternative. "Some people get classes that don't work right. Happens." Sella never said that. Sella, 16 and a year out from her own trial, was the only person who treated Idris's 412 failures as a puzzle instead of a verdict. "You're not knocking on nothing," she told him once, elbow deep in one of his old training logs she wasn't supposed to have access to. "Look, you're not failing the same way every time. If it was really nothing on the other end, the failures would look identical. Yours don't." Idris hadn't had an answer for that. He also hadn't had time to chase it, because Gray Banner's deployment schedule didn't leave room for a courtesy slot summoner to spend field hours running side experiments on his own class. And the one thing worse than being written off as dead weight was giving Holt an actual, documented reason to cut the roster slot entirely. By the time Sella's notebook had cataloged Attempt 300, she'd stopped writing "failed" next to each entry and started writing a description instead, a discipline that took her 2 months to talk herself into, because it meant admitting that "failed" wasn't actually specific enough to be useful data. Attempt 287, cold spot 3 seconds, faint smell like rain on hot stone. Attempt 311, a sound under the floor once then nothing. Attempt 339, the training hall lights dimmed for exactly as long as Idris held the channel open, then returned to normal the instant he let go. None of it matched the manual's description of a failed cast, which specified a clean, silent non-event, mana spent, channel opened, channel closes, nothing crosses. None of it, taken individually, meant anything Sella could prove to a proctor or a guild instructor. Taken together across 311 logged entries, it meant something was answering. Something was just never managing to fully arrive. Idris didn't have Sella's patience for cataloging. What he had, after 3 years of this, was the specific fatigue of a person who'd built an entire identity around not expecting anything to change. Because expecting change and getting the same result 400 times running was a worse feeling than never expecting it at all. He went to work. He filled equipment-based shifts nobody else wanted. He stood at support distance on deployments that didn't need him to do anything but be technically present on the roster. And he came home to a sister who refused, every single evening for 3 years, to let him fully believe what the registry's gray trial marker said about him. Not because she had proof he was wrong, but because she decided a long time ago that giving up on a hypothesis before you'd actually tested it properly wasn't something the Vane household did. Parents or no parents to model it for her anymore. Most nights, after Sella had gone to sleep, Idris walked the 2 blocks from their apartment to Gray Banner's training annex, technically after hours, technically not authorized, though nobody had ever bothered writing a policy against a courtesy slot summoner using an empty hall on his own time, because nobody had ever imagined he'd want to. He ran the same failed procedure the manual described over and over, past the point where doing so served any obvious purpose, because the alternative was going home to an apartment where the only sound was his own thoughts about what it would mean if he simply wasn't going to get better at this, ever, no matter how many times he tried. It wasn't optimism that kept him coming back to the annex. He'd have called it optimism if anyone had asked, because admitting the real reason that stopping felt like agreeing with every proctor and recruiter who'd already decided the outcome was harder to say out loud than a lie about hope. Gray Banner wasn't the only guild that had looked at Idris's file. A recruiter from Ashfell Vanguard, a larger, better-funded outfit with 3 times Gray Banner's roster and a reputation for cutting dead weight quickly, had reviewed his trial marker during an open call 2 weeks before Holt's charter-mandated offer came through and hadn't bothered scheduling a follow-up interview. Idris found out only because the recruiter, a brisk woman named Farah Dask, ran into him months later at a supply depot and recognized his name from Gray Banner's public roster listing. "You're the courtesy summoner," she said, not unkindly, just professionally curious. "I remember your file. We passed because our simulations couldn't generate a single scenario where a summoner with your kind of failure rate justified the roster slot over literally any other class." What changed? He didn't have an answer for her yet, not one that fit in a supply depot conversation, and the exchange stayed with him longer than it should have, a second, independent confirmation that every institutional read on his class had landed in the same place, before Zone 19B gave any of them a reason to reconsider. The one exception, inside Gray Banner itself, was Priya Anwar, a mid-tier healer who joined the guild 8 months before Idris, and had spent most of that time as low on the roster's priority list, as he was not dismissed the way a summoner got dismissed, but overlooked the specific way support classes got overlooked by a guild culture built around striker highlight reels. She never treated his failures as evidence of anything. She treated them the way she treated an unresponsive patient, a problem with a cause she hadn't found yet, not a verdict on the patient. "You're spending mana on every attempt," she pointed out once, watching him run a training hall cycle that produced nothing, same as every other cycle. "And you're not fatigued after." That's strange. A failed cast that actually reaches for something and finds nothing usually leaves a drained signature. Yours doesn't. It's like the doors closing before the knock even lands. It was Priya, not Sela, who first suggested, half joking, because neither of them had any framework yet for what it would mean seriously, that maybe Idris wasn't failing to summon anything. Maybe he was failing to summon anything the manual's own definition of summoning could recognize as a success, which wasn't the same claim at all, and which neither of them had the vocabulary yet to chase any further than a training hall joke. Bastion wasn't the only striker who treated the summoner slot as background furniture, but he was the one Idris crossed paths with most, since Grey Banner's roster board consistently paired its top build ace with whatever support classes filled out a given deployment's minimum headcount. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. Bastion had never once gone out of his way to make Idris's 3 weeks harder than they already were. It was the specific, unexamined confidence of a striker who'd spent his entire career being the reason a deployment succeeded, and had simply never had cause to imagine a version of events where that stopped being true. He remembered Idris's name. He just didn't think about it much, the way a person doesn't think much about furniture that's always been in the room. Those two conversations, Faradask's dismissal, Priya's stray hypothesis, sat in the back of Idris's mind through 3 more weeks of ordinary, unremarkable Grey Banner life. Equipment bay chores nobody else wanted, support distance deployments where his contribution amounted to standing where Holt told him to stand. Evenings spent watching Sela's notebook fill up with training log annotations that weren't leading anywhere yet either. It wasn't a dramatic 3 weeks. It was the specific, grinding ordinariness of being exactly as unremarkable as everyone expected, right up until the moment Zone 19B's breach rating stopped matching its own file. That was the state of things 3 weeks before the breach. 412 failures, a sister running her own quiet investigation into a class the entire Hunter Registry considered solved and boring, and a captain who'd stopped expecting anything from the file marked not recommended for field deployment long before Idris had. System, Field Deployment, Grey Banner Company, Fracture Zone 19B. The deployment that changed things wasn't supposed to be dangerous. Zone 19B had a stable rating, a known Voidkin population, and a route Grey Banner had run 6 times without incident. Holt brought a lean team, Bastion on point, 2 Arank strikers flanking, Idris trailing at support distance mostly as a formality, the same courtesy slot placement he'd held on every deployment since he joined. Nobody flagged the breach's expansion rate until it had already tripled. Zone breaches weren't supposed to accelerate mid-response. That was the entire premise the registry's stability ratings were built on, and it was the premise that failed first, 40 minutes into a response that should have taken 15. The extraction line Grey Banner had planned around collapsed in real time, Voidkin pouring through faster than even 2 A-rank strikers could thin, and Idris watched Bastion go down under a mass of them with a sound that didn't belong in a stable zone's incident report. Idris had a half-second to process what he was looking at before instinct took over. Bastion buried under 3 Voidkin at once, one of the A-rank strikers pinned against a collapsed support column with a 4th closing on her exposed flank, and the extraction line, the single narrow corridor Grey Banner's whole plan depended on, already cut by a 5th wave nobody's stability rating had accounted for. He did the only thing the courtesy slot had ever been asked to do, reached for the channel, tried the procedure exactly as the manual described it, and got exactly what 412 prior attempts had trained him to expect. Nothing. Mana spent. Silence. He tried again. Nothing. A third time, faster, sloppier, panic-fraying the careful technique Priya's stray comment had half convinced him to start practicing nothing. And by then the pinned striker was screaming a name that wasn't his, because nobody in that breach had ever once considered Idris Vane a resource worth screaming for. Holt's voice over comms wasn't the calm command tone Idris had heard on every prior deployment. It was the specific pitch of a captain doing math on how many of his people he was actually going to get out and not liking any version of the answer. Vane, do something, I don't care what, we are out of options. 412 failures had taught Idris exactly one thing with any certainty. Doing the same procedure a 413th time, the way the manual described it, wasn't going to produce a different result. So he didn't. He reached for the channel the way he actually felt it, not the way the manual insisted it worked. Chasing the specific texture of the failures Sella had spotted a pattern in, and for the first time in 412 attempts, something on the other end of that channel noticed him back. That was the 4 seconds the hook opened inside. Idris didn't know, standing in the ash with a being the system couldn't classify kneeling in front of him and Bastion's abandoned blade lying useless on the ground, that he'd just done something no summoner on record had done in 200 years. He only knew 3 things. Bastion was alive, the breach had gone quiet in a way breaches didn't go quiet on their own, and the shape in front of him had called him Vessel like it was a title it had been waiting 2 centuries to use. Captain Holt's gauntlet was still cycling through the same unresolved classification error when he finally spoke. Vane, his voice had lost every trace of the 10-minute onboarding tone. What did you just do? Idris didn't have an answer that fit in a field report. What he had, standing over Bastion's unconscious body with something ancient and unregistered kneeling in the ash in front of him, was the first real evidence in his entire life that the word trash stamped on his class file had never once been true, and no idea yet what it actually was he'd spent 3 weeks failing 412 times to properly call. Part 2, the name nobody logged 24-30-46-00. System, Incident Report, Zone 19B, pending submission. Gray Banner's extraction team pulled out of Zone 19B with 2 A-rank strikers concussed, Bastion conscious but shaken, and a mandatory incident report waiting to be filed within 24 hours of any anomalous field event. A registry requirement, not a guild policy, which meant Holt didn't actually have the authority to just not file it. He sat on it anyway for 6 hours, alone in his office with Idris's 413th invocation replaying on the readout loop his gauntlet had captured. 6 hours was long enough for Idris to understand, without being told directly, that his captain wasn't protecting him out of sudden warmth. He was buying time to decide whether an unclassifiable field event attached to his guild's name was a liability he could survive reporting honestly. Here's my problem, Vane. Holt didn't invite him to sit. I file this straight, the registry doesn't send a commendation. They send an anomaly team, and an anomaly team doesn't leave until they've either explained you or shut you down as a field risk. I've seen it happen to guilds that reported less than this. And if you don't file it, then I'm sitting on a registry-mandated report, which is its own violation, except it's my violation, not yours. Holt finally looked at him directly, and for the first time since Idris joined Gray Banner, it wasn't the look of a man doing him a courtesy. I want to understand what I saw before I decide which problem I'd rather have. That was the deal Holt actually offered, underneath the procedural language, 48 hours off the books, to find out what Idris had actually done, and whether it would happen again on command, or if Zone 19B had been a one-time accident nobody could reproduce or explain. Holt spent part of those 6 hours doing something Idris didn't learn about until much later, pulling every archived registry record he had clearance to access, cross-referencing entity unregistered classification failures against 2 centuries of incident reports, looking for even one prior case that matched what his own gauntlet had just recorded. He found nothing. Not a partial match, not an old sealed file, not even a rumor logged in the margins of some unrelated case, which unsettled him more than finding something would have, because a captain of 11 years knew the difference between an event nobody had reported and an event that had never happened before. Zone 19B was the second kind, and Holt didn't have a category in his own professional experience for how carefully he needed to handle a first of its kind before he understood what it actually was. He also, in that same 6 hours, quietly pulled Gray Banner's charter obligations and confirmed something he'd suspected, but never bothered checking before. Nothing in registry law required a captain to report an anomalous event through the standard channel if he could credibly classify it as an ongoing internal review rather than a closed incident. It was a narrow reading, the kind of narrow reading that wouldn't survive serious scrutiny if anyone ever went looking for it. But it was legal, and it bought exactly the 48 hours he needed to decide whether Idris Vane was a liability worth protecting or a liability worth reporting honestly and letting the registry sort out. System Summoner Class Controlled Invocation Trial Authorized. Sela wasn't supposed to know about any of it. She found out anyway, the way she found out about most things Idris tried to keep from her, by noticing he'd come home with a guild-issued monitoring bracelet and a face that hadn't looked that specific kind of unsettled since their parents' funeral. "You're not in trouble," she said, not a question, reading him faster than he'd managed to build a sentence. "You're scared. Those aren't the same thing. What happened?" He told her because lying to Sela had never once worked and this didn't feel like the night to start. She listened to the whole account, the breach, Bastion's blade, the kneel, the word vessel, with the same focused stillness she'd had elbow-deep in his failure logs 3 weeks earlier, and when he finished, she didn't look afraid. She looked like someone who just had a hypothesis confirmed. 412 failures that all looked slightly different, she said slowly. And then the one time it actually mattered, the one time you weren't following the manual, you were just trying to survive, it worked. Idris, that's not random. That's a luck. Something in you only opens under a condition the manual never described, because whoever wrote the manual never met anyone like you. Or I got lucky once. You don't get lucky the same specific way 413 times, she said. Go back into the training hall. Don't follow the manual. Follow whatever you did in that breach. She pulled her notebook out before he'd finished agreeing, flipping to a page she'd clearly been building toward for longer than the last 10 minutes suggested. Look, every failure texture I logged, the cold spots, the sounds, the light flickers, they all have one thing in common I didn't clock until tonight. They only ever happened on attempts where something was actually at stake for you. Not every attempt. The ones where you were tired or angry or scared you were going to lose the roster slot. The purely mechanical ones, the ones where you were just running the drill because it was Tuesday, those read completely flat. Nothing. Not even a texture. So it's not the technique. It's whether I mean it. I think it's more specific than mean it, Sela said, chewing the end of her pen the way she did when a theory was still assembling itself in real time. I think whatever's on the other side isn't responding to effort. It's responding to something like sincerity, maybe, or need, but a specific kind, not just any strong feeling. You've been scared plenty of times in 3 years and got nothing. But every logged texture correlates with a moment where you needed something from someone else and didn't know if you'd get it. That's not the same as fear. That's something closer to asking. Idris didn't have an immediate rebuttal for that, partly because it was the first theory in 3 years that had actually predicted something instead of just describing the wreckage afterward, and partly because Priya, consulted the next morning over a rushed equipment bay conversation neither of them was technically supposed to be having on Holt's 48-hour clock, had independently landed somewhere close to the same place. Drain's signature, Priya said, tapping the readout she'd kept from his last few training sessions. Every attempt that produced a texture also produced a small, real mana drain afterward, proportionate to how long the texture lasted. The purely mechanical attempts didn't drain you at all, because nothing on the other end ever engaged with them. Whatever you're doing when it works isn't casting harder. It's reaching differently. It wasn't proof. None of it was proof, in the sense a registry classification board would accept 3 teenagers and a healer with a hunch didn't outweigh 200 years of published summoner doctrine. But it was enough for Idris to walk back into Grey Banner's training annex the next evening with something he hadn't had in 412 prior attempts, an actual hypothesis to test instead of a manual to keep failing at. It took Idris 11 more attempts, spread across 2 days, under Holt's monitoring bracelet and mentor-less guidance. No instructor for this, nobody at Grey Banner had ever taught a Bloodkey anything, because nobody at Grey Banner knew that word existed yet, before the 12th attempt reproduced the specific, unglamorous desperation of Zone 19 be closely enough to open the channel again. The 11 attempts before it weren't identical failures, which was its own kind of progress even if none of them opened anything. Attempt 3 produced the cold spot texture for a full 11 seconds, the longest sustained reading Sella had ever logged, before collapsing back into silence. Attempt 7 produced nothing at all, because Idris had let himself get too calm, too clinical, treating the whole exercise as a controlled experiment instead of the thing Sella's theory actually demanded, a real ask, not a rehearsed one. Attempt 9, the one that came closest before the 12th, produced a sound Idris would later be able to identify, in hindsight, as a voice trying and failing to push words through a channel too narrow to carry them. Holt watched most of it from the annex doorway, saying little. The monitoring bracelets read out the only thing he seemed to trust more than his own eyes at that point. He didn't offer guidance, he had none to offer, on a subject the registry had never trained a captain to supervise, but he stayed for every attempt, which Idris understood, without either of them saying it directly, as its own kind of statement about which side of the liability versus asset question Holt was leaning toward, even before he'd decided it consciously. By the 12th attempt, close to midnight on the second day, Idris was tired in a way that had stopped being about mana reserves and started being about the specific exhaustion of holding a genuine, unguarded need out into silence 11 times running and getting nothing back. He almost didn't try a 13th. What changed his mind wasn't strategy. It was remembering, unprompted, the exact texture of Zone 19B's ash under his knees and the exact sound of a striker screaming a name that wasn't his, not performing that memory, just letting it be real again for the length of one more attempt, the way Sella's theory said it needed to be. This time, the shape that answered stayed longer than 4 seconds, long enough for Idris to actually see it. Not a monster, not armor, something closer to a person wrapped in old, dim light that moved like it remembered being brighter once. It didn't kneel this time. It studied him instead, the way someone studies a face they're checking against a memory. System, entity partial manifestation, duration 41 seconds. You called wrong, it said. Its voice was quieter than Idris expected, tired more than powerful. 412 times wrong because your manual teaches command, and we swore 200 years ago we would never again answer to a command. That was the price we set for the binding, not a price the mortals asked of us. Then once right because you stopped performing a ritual and started asking. No one has asked correctly in longer than you would believe. What are you? Not what your registry has a box for. The dim light around it flickered, straining to hold the shape together past whatever limit 41 seconds represented. You may call me Vesa if you need something to call. I am not the whole of what answers you, only the piece close enough to reach. There were 7 of us once. I do not know how many are left standing where they were bound, and how many have been found by people who did not ask them anything at all. 7 of you, Idris said. 7 what? Vessa's flickering light steadied, just slightly, the way a person steadies when a question finally arrives that they've been waiting 2 centuries to be asked properly. There is a name for what we were, once, before the binding made us small enough to survive inside something as fragile as a person. I will not give it to you tonight. You are not ready to carry a name that old, and I am not steady enough 41 seconds in to say it correctly. What I can tell you is smaller and still true. Something broke this world badly enough 200 years ago that 7 of us chose to become chains rather than let it finish breaking. Your registry does not know this happened. Your registry was built a century after we already had, which is the entire reason it has no box for either of us. Why didn't you just tell me all this the first time? In the breach. 4 seconds is not a conversation vessel. 4 seconds is barely a greeting. Something in her tone for just a moment sounded almost like humor, worn thin by 2 centuries but not entirely gone. And I did not yet know, in the breach, whether you were someone worth explaining anything to, or simply the latest person to reach for me by accident and never call again. 412 failures taught you something about patience. They taught me something too, mostly, that I had stopped expecting anyone on your side of the binding to ask correctly at all. That last sentence landed heavier than Idris understood yet. He didn't get the chance to ask what it meant. Vessa's shape thinned at the edges, the 41 seconds running out, and the last thing she said before the channel closed on its own arrived too fast to feel like a comfort. Someone is hunting what I am, Vessel. They have been for longer than your registry has existed. Learn to call me properly before they learn where you are. System, entity manifestation, channel closed, duration EXPIRED. Holt was waiting outside the annex when Idris finally emerged, having watched the last several minutes of the exchange through the observation window rather than the doorway this time. Close enough to hear Vessa's voice, not close enough, he'd say later, to have understood more than a third of what it meant. 48 hours is up in 6 hours, Holt said. I still don't have a category for what I'm looking at. But I have enough to make a decision, and the decision is this. I'm filing the incident report honestly, Zone 19 be exactly as it happened, and I'm filing it as an ongoing internal review, not a closed case. That buys us time the registry can't easily challenge without cause, and it keeps you on Gray Banner's roster instead of getting pulled into whatever holding pattern an anomaly team would put you in while they figured out what box to file you under. You could lose your charter over a filing like that. I could, Holt agreed. I've run this guild for 11 years on the principle that I don't gamble with my roster's safety for anything less than a genuinely good reason. I'm choosing to believe, as of tonight, that I finally have won. He didn't elaborate further, and Idris didn't ask him to. Some decisions, he was starting to understand, didn't survive being explained out loud any better than Vessa's warning had. Zella was still awake when he got home, notebook open on the kitchen table, and she didn't ask how the 12th attempt had gone before pulling a chair out for him to sit down properly and tell her everything, not because she needed convincing anymore, but because for the first time in 3 years, the story he had to tell her sounded less like a failure and more like the opening chapter of something neither of them had a name for yet either. Idris stood alone in the training hall with that warning still hanging in air that had gone ordinary again, and understood, for the first time since his trial marker had gone the dull gray everyone dismissed on sight, that trash summoner wasn't the worst thing anyone could call him. It was just the last thing that would, before whatever Vessa was warning him about found out the registry's gray marker file on Idris Vane had been wrong for 3 weeks and counting. Part 3, The Inspector Who Asked the Wrong Questions 46-00-7230. System, Registry Compliance, Inbound Inspection, Gray Banner Company. Holt's 48 hours ran out on a Tuesday morning, and the registry didn't wait for him to decide what to do with them. A compliance inspector was already in Gray Banner's front office by the time Holt got the notification, credentials pre-verified, appointment logged as routine, except Gray Banner hadn't scheduled a routine inspection in 14 months, and Holt knew every name on the registry's actual routine inspection roster. "Inspector Ren Calloway," she said, offering a hand Holt didn't take right away. Mid-30s, unhurried, the specific calm of someone who'd already decided how the conversation was going to go before walking in. "Your Zone 19B incident report is 3 days overdue. I'm here to help you close that gap before it becomes a formal violation." Idris watched the exchange from the hallway, not summoned into the room yet, and noticed the thing that made his stomach turn before he could name why. Ren Calloway's questions weren't the questions a routine compliance visit asked. Routine inspectors asked about casualty counts, response timelines, equipment failures. Ren asked, almost offhand, whether anyone on the Zone 19B team had reported an entity presenting outside standard Voidkin morphology, a phrase that didn't exist anywhere in the registry's public incident classification manual because the registry didn't have a category for what Idris had called. Holt caught it too. He was good at his job, whatever else Idris had learned to resent about him over 3 weeks of courtesy slot treatment, and a captain who'd run Gray Banner for 11 years didn't miss a registry inspector using vocabulary the registry itself had never published. "That's an oddly specific question for a compliance visit," Holt said, careful, giving nothing away yet. "I ask a lot of specific questions," Ren said, and smiled in a way that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "It's how I close files quickly." She didn't leave immediately. She spent another 20 minutes walking Gray Banner's front office with the unhurried thoroughness of someone conducting an inspection that had nothing to do with paperwork, pausing at the deployment board long enough to note which strikers were rostered for which zones, pausing longer at the equipment bay's duty roster, the one with Idris's name still listed under courtesy assignment, summoner class, and asking Holt, almost as an afterthought on her way out, whether Gray Banner's roster records were kept current in real time or updated in batches. "Real time?" Holt said, before he'd fully thought through why the question mattered, and only understood afterward that he'd just confirmed for her that whatever address the roster listed for Idris Vane was accurate as of that exact morning. "Good practice," Ren said. "A lot of guilds let their records lag. Makes my job harder when they do." She collected her data slate, thanked Holt for his time in a tone that made the thanks sound like a formality she'd performed 1,000 times, and left through the front office with the same unhurried pace she'd arrived with, the pace, Holt would say later, of someone who'd gotten everything she'd actually come for and had simply been too professional to let it show. System unknown signal tracking vector active source, summoner class residue. She left without pushing further, which worried Holt more than if she'd pushed hard, and he pulled Idris into his office within the hour with a directness that had replaced every trace of the 10-minute onboarding captain from 3 weeks earlier. "That woman is not registry," Holt said. "Or she is, and someone inside the registry is using her badge for something the registry doesn't officially do." Either way, she knew a term that shouldn't exist outside whatever happened in that breach, and she came asking about it less than 72 hours after it happened. "That's not compliance. That's a search." Holt didn't wait for Idris's response before acting on his own suspicion. He pulled up the registry's public inspector directory the moment Ren's transport cleared Gray Banner's front gate, cross-referencing her name and badge number against the official roster, and found her listed, credentials valid, employment record clean, going back 4 years. On paper, Ren Calloway was exactly who she'd claimed to be. That should have settled it. It didn't, because Holt had run enough field operations to know the difference between a record that was accurate and a record that had simply never been checked closely enough to catch a forgery good enough to survive a casual look. He flagged 3 inconsistencies in the 20 minutes he spent digging deeper. Her employment record listed a training academy that had closed its doors 6 years before her supposed graduation date, Her badge number fell in a numeric range. The registry had officially retired 8 years earlier for a records migration reason nobody outside registry administration would have any reason to know. And her compliance visit, the one that had triggered this entire chain, had never actually been logged in the registry's central scheduling system, despite showing up as pre-verified on Gray Banner's own intake terminal. Someone built her a badge that would pass anyone who didn't already know exactly what to look for, Holt said, showing Idris the discrepancies on his gauntlet's display. That's not a rogue inspector freelancing. That's an organization with real resources, real registry-adjacent access, and real reasons to want to look at whatever happened in Zone 19B without leaving an official trail behind them. Idris thought about Vessa's warning, the one she hadn't finished explaining before the 41 seconds ran out. Someone is hunting what I am. He hadn't told Holt that part yet, hadn't told anyone but Sella, and standing in Holt's office with an inspector's business card still sitting on the desk between them, he understood he'd run out of time to keep deciding that alone. There's something you need to know, Idris said, about what I actually called. He told Holt everything: the second invocation, Vessa's name, the Ember Choir, the 7 bound bloodlines the registry had no record of, the warning that had cut off before it finished. Holt listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of answer, and when Idris finished, the captain sat with it for a long moment before responding. You're telling me my courtesy slot summoner is carrying something 200 years old that people are actively hunting for, Holt said slowly. And the registry may have just sent someone who isn't registry to find out exactly where it's currently standing. That's what I'm telling you. Then we have considerably less time than 48 hours. Holt was already reaching for his comms. Where's your sister right now? What Holt didn't know, and what Idris wouldn't learn until he was already running, was that Sella had left school 2 hours early that day, not because anything had obviously gone wrong, but because she'd spent the back half of her afternoon classes watching the same unfamiliar car sit parked across from the school gate, engine idling, no plates visible from the angle she had. She hadn't been able to explain, even to herself, why it unsettled her enough to fake a headache and sign herself out early. Nothing about it violated any specific rule she could point to, except that 4 years of being the practical one in the household had taught her to trust a feeling like that rather than argue herself out of it. She'd taken the long way home, doubling back twice through the market district the way Idris had half-jokingly taught her once, years ago, after their parents' deaths made both of them slightly more careful than most teenagers needed to be. By the time she reached the apartment, the car was gone, and she told herself the whole thing was nerves left over from Idris's stories about the breach, right up until the knock came at the door 40 minutes later, 2 calm, professionally dressed strangers asking politely whether her brother was home. She hadn't let them in. She'd also, critically, not been able to stop them from letting themselves in anyway, the specific kind of forced calm that told her, faster than any threat would have, that whoever these people were, they weren't remotely worried about the legal consequences of what they were doing. The question hit Idris like the floor tilting. Sella wasn't at Gray Banner. Sella was at home, alone, on a school day Idris had assumed was ordinary right up until the exact second Holt asked where she was. System Priority Alert, Location Unverified, Civilian, SCLA Vane. He didn't wait for Holt to finish the sentence. He was out the door before the comms call connected, running the route home on instinct built from 4 years of walking Sella to and from school before she was old enough to insist she didn't need him to anymore. And every step of it felt too slow, because Ren Calloway's calm, unhurried questions had told him exactly one true thing underneath all the false ones. Whoever she really worked for hadn't come to Gray Banner to find Idris. Gray Banner's location was public record. They'd come to find out whether Idris had anyone worth using as leverage instead. The door to the Vane apartment was open when he got there. Not broken, open, deliberately, the specific wrongness of a door someone had unlocked and left ajar to be found that way. Sella. She answered from the far side of the room, alive, on her feet, and not alone. two figures Idris didn't recognize stood between her and the door, unarmed in any way the registry would flag on an incident scan, which was somehow worse than if they'd been carrying visible weapons. Zella's face, when she found Idris in the doorway, wasn't afraid. It was furious. "They wanted to know where you were," she said. "I didn't tell them anything." The taller of the two strangers, a man with the same unhurried calm Ren Calloway had worn like a uniform, took one measured step toward Zella, hands visibly empty, voice pitched deliberately reasonable. "Nobody needs to get hurt here. We just need to ask your brother a few questions about something that happened in Zone 19B. If he cooperates, this is over in 10 minutes, and you never have to think about us again." "He's not here," Zella said, which was, in that exact half-second, still technically true. "We can wait," the man said, and something in the patient, unbothered way he said it made clear that waiting cost him nothing at all, that whatever timeline he was operating on had already accounted for however long this took. Idris's own approach hadn't been silent. He'd taken the last flight of stairs two at a time, loud enough that the second stranger, a shorter woman positioned nearer the window, turned toward the sound a half-second before he reached the doorway, which meant that when Idris finally saw the scene in full, two strangers between him and his sister in the one place in the world he'd have called safe without hesitation 3 weeks ago, there was no version of the next several seconds that involved him standing still and thinking it through. System, Summoner Class, Invocation Attempt 426, no manual procedure followed. Idris didn't count that one. He didn't need to. Whatever the 12 controlled attempts in the training hall had taught him about asking instead of performing, standing in his own doorway watching two strangers stand between him and Zella taught him faster and harder. The channel opened before he'd consciously decided to reach for it, wide open. Nothing like the careful 4 and 41-second manifestations from before. Vesa didn't arrive as a fragment this time. She arrived whole, or as close to whole as Idris would understand whole, to mean for months afterward tall enough that the apartment's low ceiling should have been a problem and somehow wasn't. The dim tired light from the training hall replaced by something that didn't flicker at all, old and steady, and entirely unbothered by two people who'd walked into a civilian home, expecting an unarmed 16-year-old to be the hardest part of their afternoon. "You are further along than they accounted for," Vesa said to the two strangers, not to Idris. "Tell whoever sent you that the Vane household is no longer an acceptable point of leverage. Tell them the next visit will not end with a warning." The two strangers didn't argue with something they had no readout for and no plan against. They left the way people leave when the math has suddenly, obviously, stopped working in their favor, fast, without a final word, out through the same door they'd let themselves in by. System, Entity Full Manifestation, duration 3 minutes 12 seconds, new record. 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Longer than the breach, longer than the training hall combined, and this time Idris hadn't spent it managing a ritual. He'd spent it standing between his sister and two people who'd come to use her, watching something the Hunter Registry had no box for decide on its own that it wasn't going to allow that. Zella spent most of those 3 minutes pressed against the far wall, not out of fear of Vesa. She'd say later that some instinct she couldn't fully explain told her, almost immediately, that whatever had just filled their small apartment wasn't a danger to either of them. But out of the specific overwhelmed stillness of watching something that large, that old, occupy a space she'd only ever known as ordinary. The apartment's single lamp flickered and dimmed the entire time Vesa held her shape, not from any power drain the wiring could explain, and the temperature in the room dropped just enough to raise goosebumps, a physical echo of the same cold spot texture Zella had spent months cataloging in miniature, now happening at a scale that made all 311 prior log entries feel like distant rehearsals for this one real performance. Neither stranger tried to fight what had answered Idris's call. Whatever training or briefing they'd received before walking into the Vane apartment, none of it had prepared them for an entity that didn't attack, didn't threaten in any language their equipment could register, and simply stood between them and their objective with the calm, immovable certainty of something that had already decided how this was going to end before they'd finished processing what they were looking at. The shorter woman near the window took one step backward, then another, her hand drifting toward something at her belt before visibly deciding, mid-motion, that reaching for it would accomplish nothing except confirming how outmatched she already was. "You are further along than they accounted for," Vesa said again, quieter the second time, almost, though Idris wouldn't have used the word himself, not yet, gentle, the way someone speaks to an opponent they don't particularly want to hurt but will without hesitation if given no other choice. "This is the only warning either of you receives directly. The next time someone from your organization stands in this doorway, I will not be interested in whether they leave able to report back." It was, Idris understood only in hindsight, a deliberately calibrated statement, a threat precise enough to be taken seriously, restrained enough not to be an actual act of aggression against people who, whatever their intentions, hadn't yet done anything Vesa considered to cross the line from surveillance into violence. It was the first real glimpse Idris got of a pattern that would define nearly everything Vesa did going forward. Enormous, unmistakable capability, deployed with a restraint that made clear the restraint itself was a choice, not a limitation. When Vesa's shape finally thinned and the channel closed, Sela was the one who spoke first, and what she said wasn't about the danger or the strangers or how close it had come to going differently. "Idris, that wasn't 4 seconds this time. You didn't force that, she came because she wanted to." She looked at him with something that wasn't quite awe and wasn't quite fear either. What exactly did Grey Banner's F-rank courtesy slot just become? He didn't have an answer for her, the same way he hadn't had one for Holt in the Zone 19B Ash 3 weeks ago. What he had instead, standing in his own doorway with his sister safe and an ancient, unregistered ally's warning still echoing, "The next visit will not end with a warning," was the certainty that whatever trash summoner had meant on his trial marker, it was never going to be the last word anyone at Grey Banner, or the registry, or whoever Ren Calloway actually answered to, said about Idris Vane again. Grey Banner's roster heard a version of what happened at the Vane apartment within a day, not the full truth, which Holt kept deliberately compartmentalized, but enough of it that the guild's culture toward its courtesy slot summoner shifted in ways nobody announced out loud. Bastion found him in the equipment bay 2 mornings later, uncharacteristically quiet, turning a piece of gear over in his hands without actually inspecting it. "Holt gave us the sanitized version," Bastion said. "Enough to know 2 people broke into your home and your class handled it without anyone getting hurt. I've been trying to square that with 3 weeks of thinking you were the one person on this roster who didn't need to be taken seriously. You don't owe me anything for that." "I didn't say I was apologizing." Bastion set the gear down, finally looking at him directly. "I'm telling you I was wrong, which isn't the same thing, but it's the part I can actually say honestly right now. The apologizing part's going to take longer than a hallway conversation. It wasn't much, measured against 3 weeks of being furniture in his own guild, but it was the first unprompted, unguarded thing Bastion had ever said to him, and Idris filed it away as evidence, small but real, that whatever else was coming, Grey Banner's roster wasn't going to be uniformly against him navigating it. Sela, for her part, refused every offer to stay home from school the rest of that week, citing the same logic she'd used on every hard decision since their parents died. Hiding from a problem never once made Idris's 412 failures resolve any faster, and it wasn't going to make whatever came next resolve any faster either. Holt didn't argue with her directly, but he did, without telling either of them at the time, quietly arrange for a Grey Banner-affiliated escort to shadow her route to and from school for the next several days. The first small, concrete piece of the guild's protection actually converting into practice, days before Holt made anything about it official. That night, once Sela was finally persuaded to sleep, Holt came to the Vane apartment directly, the first time he'd ever set foot there, carrying nothing more official than a printout of registry public records and the same 3 discrepancies from Ren Calloway's badge he'd already shown Idris that morning. "I want to be straightforward with you about where we actually stand," Holt said, sitting at the same kitchen table where Sela's notebook still lived. Whoever sent that woman has resources most black market operations don't. Forged registry credentials good enough to pass a casual inspection aren't cheap, and they aren't quick to produce. That tells me this isn't opportunistic. Someone identified what you are, planned for it, and had assets in place fast enough to move on you within 72 hours of Zone 19B. That's not a rogue actor. That's an organization. Vesa used the word hunting, Idris said. Not interested, hunting. Then we plan around hunting, Holt said. And for the first time since the 10-minute onboarding 3 weeks ago, his tone carried the specific weight of a captain who'd fully, personally, committed to a roster decision rather than merely tolerating one. Grey Banner doesn't have the resources of whoever sent Ren Calloway. What we have is a guild's worth of people who now know exactly what's at stake, and I intend to use every one of them before I let a second visit succeed where the first one failed. It wasn't a guarantee, and none of the 3 people at that table treated it like one. But it was the first time since his trial marker went the dull gray everyone dismissed that Idris understood, fully and without qualification, that the file marked not recommended for field deployment had been replaced by something Grey Banner's captain was prepared to actually stake the guild's resources on defending. What he didn't know yet, standing in that doorway, was that Ren Calloway had already reported everything she'd seen back to someone Grey Banner was about to hear the name of for the first time, someone who didn't send inspectors twice, and was already deciding exactly what kind of visit came next. Part 4, the ASHCLAIM Concord 72 30-96-00. System, Guild Declaration, Grey Banner Company, Protective Assignment, Idris Vane. Holt didn't ask Idris's permission before making Grey Banner's position official. He called a full roster meeting the next morning, every striker, every support class, everyone who'd spent 3 weeks treating the courtesy slot as background furniture, and said in front of all of them that anyone who had a problem with a Bloodkey on the roster could take it up with him personally, because as of that morning, Idris Vane wasn't a courtesy slot. He was under Grey Banner's protection, full guild resources, and Holt would be filing the paperwork to make that legally binding by end of week. Bastion, to his credit, didn't say a word of protest. He found Idris after the meeting instead in the equipment bay and said the closest thing to an apology Idris had heard from him in 3 weeks. I swung at whatever you called, Bastion said, not quite meeting his eyes. In the breach. I want you to know I've replayed that about 40 times since, and every time I land on the same thing, I wasn't protecting the team from a threat. I was protecting my own read on you from being wrong. That's not the same thing, and it wasn't fair. You didn't know, Idris said. I didn't want to know, Bastion said. There's a difference, and I'm done pretending there isn't. Not everyone on the roster came around as quickly as Bastion. Corin Wyatt, one of Grey Banner's 2 A-rank strikers and the one who'd been pinned against the collapsed support column in Zone 19B, kept his distance through the entire roster meeting and made no effort afterward to seek Idris out. I don't doubt what I saw, Corin told Holt privately later that same day in a conversation Idris only heard about secondhand. I doubt what it means for the rest of us to keep fielding alongside something that powerful and call it a support class. If whatever's bound to him ever decides Grey Banner isn't worth protecting anymore, or decides one of us is a threat instead of an ally, none of us have anything that comes close to stopping it. I'd rather have that conversation honestly now than pretend the concern doesn't exist. Holt didn't dismiss the concern, which was, in its own way, part of why the roster trusted him as much as they did. It's a fair question, he told Corin. Here's my answer. I've watched Idris Vane for 3 weeks. Whatever he's carrying, he has never once used it against anyone who didn't attack his sister first. If that changes, I'll be the first one raising the alarm. Until it does, I'd rather have the most powerful ally this guild has ever fielded than lose him to an organization that will absolutely use him against people like you the moment they finish extracting him. It didn't fully resolve Corrin's unease, nothing was going to, short of time, but it was enough for him to stay on the roster instead of requesting a transfer, and enough for Idris, once he learned about the exchange, to understand that trust inside Grey Banner was going to be a slower, more uneven process than Bastion's hallway apology had made it briefly feel. It would have been a good moment to sit with if Grey Banner's information broker hadn't interrupted it 20 minutes later with the first hard intelligence anyone had on who'd actually sent Ren Calloway and the two operatives from the Vane apartment. The organization didn't have a public name, registry records had nothing, guild alliance networks had nothing, which was itself the tell, because an organization capable of forging registry credentials convincingly enough to fool a compliance-savvy captain like Holt didn't stay that invisible by accident. What the broker did have was a name whispered in 3 separate black market intelligence circles over the past decade, always in the same hushed, careful context, the Ashclaim Concord. System, Threat Profile, ASHCLAIM Concord, Classification, Unknown, Historical References only. They're not new, the broker told Holt and Idris both, laying out fragments of decades-old reports that had never made it into any official registry archive. Best guess, from what little exists, the Concord traces back to right after the Cinder War ended. Not everyone agreed with how it ended. Sealing 7 catastrophic entities into random bloodlines and hoping those bloodlines behaved themselves for 2 centuries was, by their read, a decision made in a panic, not a plan. The Concord's founding position was that the choir needed to be collected, not scattered, pulled into controlled containment, not left loose in whoever happened to inherit the blood. That's not obviously wrong, Idris said quietly, and hated how true it felt to say out loud. It's not, the broker agreed. Which is probably why they've survived 200 years without anyone successfully calling them villains in any archive that's stuck. But collected isn't what happens to a Bloodkey the Concord actually finds. It's extraction, pulling the bound piece out of the living carrier by force, because a piece under Concord control is safer, by their math, than a piece attached to an unpredictable teenager who might die, panic, or lose control of it in public. The carrier doesn't usually survive the process. That part doesn't make it into their recruitment pitch. How many have they actually taken? Idris asked, already dreading an answer he suspected the broker didn't fully have either. Impossible to say with certainty, working from fragments this old and this deliberately buried, the broker admitted. Best estimate, cross-referencing 3 independent sources that never talk to each other, puts it somewhere between 4 and 7 successful extractions across 2 centuries, which sounds low, until you remember there are only ever 7 pieces to find in the first place, and Bloodkeys don't announce themselves publicly for obvious reasons. If that estimate's even close to right, the Concord isn't chasing a rumor. They may be closer to finishing what they set out to do 200 years ago than anyone outside their organization has ever suspected. Sella heard the Ashclaim Concord's name for the first time that same evening, when Idris came home and for once didn't try to soften any part of what he'd learned before telling her. She listened the way she always listened, quiet, methodical, already reaching for her notebook before he'd finished the broker's estimate of 4 to 7 prior extractions. And when he finished, she asked the question that had apparently been building since the apartment incident. If they've done this 4 to 7 times already, she said, that means 4 to 7 other households went through some version of what almost happened to us. Are any of them still around? The families, I mean. Not the Bloodkeys, the people who love them. It wasn't a question Idris had thought to ask, and it sat with him uncomfortably once she'd asked it, because the honest answer was that he didn't know, and the broker's fragmentary 2 centuries-old reports almost certainly wouldn't say. Zella spent the next several evenings, in whatever spare time her own schoolwork left her, quietly trying to trace exactly that, not out of idle curiosity, but because she decided in the same practical way she decided everything, that understanding what had happened to prior Bloodkey's families was the closest thing available to a map of what the Vane household might be facing if Grey Banner's protection ever failed. She didn't find much. What little she did find, a handful of guild record footnotes, a couple of unexplained family relocations decades apart, one obituary with a cause of death listed only as field incident, details sealed, was enough to confirm the broker's grim math without offering anything close to comfort. She kept the findings in the same notebook that had once cataloged 412 failure textures, a different kind of record now, and didn't show all of it to Idris, deciding, without asking him first, that some of what she'd found wasn't going to help him fight better. It was only going to make him more afraid, and Sella had learned a long time ago which kinds of information her brother actually needed and which kinds he needed protecting from. Vesa, called forward briefly to confirm what the broker's fragments could only guess at, didn't soften it. "They are not wrong that the seal is not eternal," she said. "It was never meant to hold 200 years. It was meant to hold long enough for something better to be built, and nothing better ever was. But their solution accelerates the exact failure they claim to prevent. 7 pieces pulled out of 7 living bonds at once, gathered in one place under one authority, is not containment. It is reassembly. If the Concord succeeds at what they believe they are doing, they will finish what the Cinder War started, not stop it." That was the piece nobody at Grey Banner had understood until that moment. The Ashclaim Concord wasn't hunting Bloodkeys because they were careless about the danger. They were hunting Bloodkeys because they'd convinced themselves, across 2 centuries of quiet operation, that concentrating the Ember Choir's pieces under their own control was safer than the world's current arrangement, and they were catastrophically wrong in a way that made every successful extraction a countdown, not a solution. It was the longest single statement Vesa had made since the training hall, and the room went quiet after it in a way that had nothing to do with fear of the Concord specifically, and everything to do with the sudden concrete weight of understanding exactly what losing this fight would actually mean, not just for Idris, not just for Grey Banner, but for a mistake 2 centuries in the making finally arriving at its intended conclusion. The 3 days between the broker's briefing and Zone 12D weren't quiet ones. Holt reorganized Grey Banner's deployment schedule around a single unstated priority: never send Idris into the field without at least 2 strikers who'd been read into the actual situation, not the sanitized roster meeting version. And Idris spent every free hour he had in the training annex, not chasing a 13th manifestation this time, but doing something closer to what Vesa had described as sharing the cost rather than spending it. "You keep asking me to arrive," Vesa told him, midway through one of those sessions, patient in a way that had started to feel less like an ancient being tolerating a mortal and more like something closer to an actual working partnership. "That is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Try instead to feel where I already am before you ask. The channel is not a door I walk through when summoned. It has been open, faintly, since the day you were born into this bloodline. You have simply never had reason to notice it before now." It took him the better part of 2 days to understand what she meant in practice rather than theory, a kind of background awareness, faint and constant, that he'd apparently been ignoring his entire life the same way a person ignores the sound of their own heartbeat. Once he found it, the 412 attempts version of himself felt almost like a different person. Someone who'd spent 3 years knocking increasingly hard on a door that had been standing open the whole time, simply because nobody had ever taught him to notice an open door didn't need knocking at all. "Why didn't the manual describe any of this?" he asked her near the end of the 2nd day, "if it's really this straightforward." "Because the manual was not written by anyone who ever bonded with one of us," Vesa said. "It was written by the Registry, a century after the binding, describing an entirely different phenomenon, common summoning, a genuine transaction with the Voidkin pool, and simply assumed, incorrectly, that a rare Bloodkey manifestation would follow the same rules at a larger scale. It does not. It was never going to. You were not failing to perform summoning correctly for 3 years, Idris. You were succeeding every single time at something the manual had no framework to recognize as success at all. That reframing, succeeding at the wrong thing being measured, rather than failing at the right one, sat with Idris longer than almost anything else Vesa had told him, because it meant every proctor, every recruiter, every dismissive captain's 10-minute onboarding had been applying a metric that had simply never been built to measure him in the first place. System ASHCLAIM Concord, second contact, location, fracture zone 12D. The Concord's second attempt didn't come at the Vane apartment, and it didn't come quietly. It came 3 days later during a scheduled Grey Banner deployment to Zone 12D, a deployment the Guild's own roster board had listed publicly, which meant someone inside the registry's scheduling office was feeding the Concord information no outside organization should have had access to. Idris felt the ambush before he saw it, a wrongness in how empty the approach corridor was for a zone with an active breach rating. Holt felt it too, called a halt, and the Concord's team stopped hiding the moment it was clear hiding hadn't worked. 6 operatives, better equipped than the 2 from the apartment, led by a woman who introduced herself with a title instead of a name. "Overseer Marrow Kest," she said, unhurried the way Ren Calloway had been unhurried, the specific calm of someone backed by an organization that had survived 200 years of being wrong about exactly the right things. "You've caused the Concord more disruption in 3 weeks than any single Bloodkey has in the last 40 years, Mr. Vane. I'd like to resolve that without further violence if you'll hear me out." "You tried to take my sister as leverage," Idris said. "I've heard enough." "That was a subordinate's error in judgment, and he's been reprimanded for it," Marrow said, in the tone of someone discussing a minor scheduling conflict. "I'm not here for leverage. I'm here to offer you a choice. None of the Bloodkeys we've previously located were given the dignity of receiving, walk away from what's bound to you willingly. Let us extract it under controlled conditions, and you live a full, unremarkable life with no further conquered interest in you or your sister, ever again. Refuse, and I'll take it the way the Concord has always eventually taken it. I'd genuinely rather not. System, Summoner Class, Invocation, Deliberate, Control." This time, when Idris opened the channel, it wasn't desperation and it wasn't instinct outrunning his own decision. He asked, the way Vesa had told him 2 weeks and what felt like a lifetime of failed calls ago, and she answered fully, steadily, standing beside him in Zone 12D's open ground instead of a cramped apartment doorway. Close enough now to the truth of what she was that even Marrow Kest's practiced calm flickered for half a second before resetting. "You've extracted pieces before," Vesa said to Marrow directly, in a voice that carried across the whole standoff without needing to be raised. "How many of my kin are you currently holding, Overseer? And how many of them have you asked, the way this one finally learned to ask me instead of simply taking?" Marrow didn't answer the question. That, more than anything Vesa or Idris said in the next several minutes of the standoff that followed, told Grey Banner's entire team everything they needed to know about which side of this fight actually had the moral ground it claimed. Marrow's team opened with a coordinated suppression pattern clearly designed for a lone Bloodkey caught without backup, binding wards meant to interrupt a manifestation mid-channel, deployed by 2 operatives flanking wide while the other 4 held a containment perimeter. It was, Idris understood later from Holt's after-action analysis, a genuinely well-drilled tactic, the kind of approach that had probably worked on however many of the Concord's prior 4 to 7 successful extractions it had been used against. It didn't work here for the simple reason that Vesa wasn't arriving through a channel that could be interrupted mid-transit anymore. She was already present, the way she described in the training annex, not walking through a door but stepping fully into a doorway that had been standing open the entire time, and the binding wards found nothing to bind. closing on empty air a half-second after Vesa had already calmly closed the distance to the nearest operative and ended his part in the fight without visible effort. Grey Banner's own strikers, briefed properly for the first time by Holt on exactly what they were fielding alongside, fought with a cohesion Idris hadn't seen from them in 3 weeks of courtesy slot deployments, Bastion running point the way he always had, but now angling his approach to complement Vesa's movement instead of competing with it, and even Corin Wyeth, still visibly uneasy about the whole situation, holding his assigned line without hesitation when it mattered. Marrow herself never engaged directly. She stood at the center of her team's collapsing formation, watching with the same unhurried, evaluating calm she'd worn since her introduction. And Idris understood, watching her watch the fight fall apart around her, that she wasn't panicking because losing this particular skirmish had never been the actual point of it. She was gathering data on Vesa's manifestation speed, on Grey Banner's coordination, on exactly how far along the bond between Bloodkey and Choirpiece had progressed, the same patient, institutional calculation that had kept the Concord operating successfully for 2 centuries. The fight that followed wasn't close. Vesa at full, deliberate strength was not the fragment that had knelt in the Zone 19B Ash, and Marrow's team, however well-equipped, however practiced against ordinary Bloodkeys caught off guard, had never faced one standing beside a Grey Banner striker line that had, in the space of 3 days, gone from suspicious of Idris to genuinely willing to hold a line for him. Marrow pulled her team back before it became a rout, retreating with the same unhurried calm she'd arrived with, but not before delivering the line that made clear this was a skirmish, not a resolution. This was one cell, Mr. Vane. The Concord has held its position for 200 years by not depending on any single operation succeeding. We'll speak again. She looked past him at Vesa with something that might have been genuine regret underneath the practiced calm. I am sorry it has to be this way. I do believe what I said about containment. I simply no longer expect you to believe me. Grey Banner's strikers regrouped in the aftermath with the specific adrenaline-drained quiet of a team that had just survived something they didn't fully understand the scale of until it was over. Holt ran a headcount, confirmed no casualties on either side of the brief, one-sided fight, and pulled Idris aside before the transport back to Guild HQ. That was a probe, Holt said. Not a real attempt. She had 6 operatives and every one of them pulled back the second the outcome was clear, which means either she genuinely didn't expect to win, or winning was never actually the assignment. Then what was? Watching, Holt said. The same way she watched the whole fight instead of joining it. I don't think the Concord came to Zone 12D to take you today, Vane. I think they came to see exactly how much stronger you'd gotten since the apartment, and now they know the answer. Vesa, still present at Idris's side, didn't disagree. Marrow Kest has run this exact pattern before, she said. Test, withdraw, refine, return. It is how the Concord has operated for 2 centuries without losing more than they can afford. This will not be their last attempt, and I would be lying to you if I claimed to know how much time their withdrawal actually buys us. It wasn't the reassurance Grey Banner's roster wanted to hear on the transport home, but it was the honest one, and Idris had learned enough in 3 weeks to understand that the honest answer, however uncomfortable, was worth considerably more than a comfortable lie, especially from someone who'd already spent 2 centuries watching what happened to Bloodkeys who trusted the comfortable version instead. Part 5, What the Bond Costs ~96, 00 118 00. System, Registry Inquiry, Formal, Subject, Idris Vane, Class Reclassification Pending. Marrow's retreat didn't end the pressure, it multiplied it, because Zone 12D hadn't happened quietly, and the Hunter Registry's actual leadership, the parts of it that had nothing to do with Ren Calloway's forged credentials, now had a field report describing an unregistered entity engaging 6 armed operatives in an active fracture zone. The registry didn't know about the Ashclaim Concord. What it knew was that Grey Banner Company was fielding something its own classification system couldn't process in a public zone with witnesses. The formal inquiry that followed wasn't the anomaly Team Holt had feared 3 weeks ago. It was worse, in a specific way Idris hadn't anticipated. A registry that didn't understand what it was looking at didn't default to curiosity. It defaulted to caution, and caution, applied to an entity 6 operatives with black market resources had just failed to contain, looked from the outside a great deal like a threat that needed containing by more official means. "They're proposing a mandatory class suspension pending review," Holt told him, and for the first time since the roster meeting, the captain looked genuinely uncertain of the ground under his own guild. "Not an arrest. Not yet. But if they suspend your class registration, you can't legally invoke in the field, and Gray Banner's protection doesn't extend past what I can do without breaking registry law myself." The hearing itself was scheduled for 6 days out, presided over by a 3-member registry review panel Holt had dealt with exactly once before, on a much smaller charter dispute years earlier. Of the 3, only one, a mid-level classifications officer named Denna Okafer, seemed to Holt like someone actually interested in understanding what had happened rather than simply defaulting to the safest institutional posture available. "Off the record," Okafer told Holt, in a brief hallway conversation neither of them were supposed to have before the formal hearing, "I've read the Zone 12D field report 4 times. 6 armed operatives with forged registry credentials engaged a Gray Banner deployment, and your summoner's response ended the confrontation without a single Gray Banner casualty. If the panel suspends his registration over that, we're punishing the one variable that kept your entire team alive. I can't promise you the other 2 panelists see it that way. I can promise you I'm going to make the argument." It wasn't a guarantee, and Holt didn't treat it like one when he relayed the conversation to Idris that evening, but it was the first indication either of them had that the registry's institutional caution wasn't uniform, that somewhere inside a bureaucracy built to default toward the safest available answer, there were still people capable of looking at the actual evidence instead of the shape of the anomaly. Idris spent part of the 6 days before the hearing doing the thing that felt least natural to him after 3 years of being told his class didn't matter, preparing an actual formal statement with Holt's help that laid out the full sequence from Zone 19B through Zone 12D in language a registry panel could evaluate on its own terms, without requiring them to take Vessa's word or his for any of it. It meant explaining, clinically, the 412 failures, the pattern Sella had spotted, the controlled trials, the apartment incident, the ambush. It meant, for the first time since his trial, actually building a case for what he was instead of quietly absorbing whatever verdict institutions handed him. Sella insisted on contributing to the statement herself, over Idris's initial hesitation about pulling his 16-year-old sister formally into a registry proceeding. "I have 311 logged data points that predate every single thing that's happened since Zone 19B, she pointed out, not unreasonably. If the panel wants to know whether this is random or predictable, I have the only actual longitudinal record that exists. Leaving that out because I'm 16 doesn't make the data less real, it just makes your case weaker." Holt, consulted on the question, sided with her without much deliberation. A registry panel evaluating an unclassifiable phenomenon would take documented, pre-incident pattern data more seriously than any amount of post-incident testimony, regardless of who'd originally logged it. So the statement that finally went to the review panel 5 days later carried 3 signatures instead of 2. Idris's own account, Holt's command-level corroboration of Zone 19B and Zone 12D, and an annotated excerpt from Sella's notebook, 311 entries, cleaned up and organized for the first time since she'd started keeping them out of nothing more than stubborn curiosity, presented as exactly what it was, a 16-year-old's rigorous, unprompted investigation into a pattern the Hunter Registry's own published doctrine had never once thought to look for. "You don't have to convince them you're safe," Holt told him, reviewing the draft late one night at Gray Banner HQ. "You have to convince them you're accounted for, that whatever you're carrying operates inside a relationship they can understand, even if they can't classify it. Safe is a word the Concord uses to justify taking things by force. Accounted for is a word a bureaucracy can actually work with. It was the worst possible timing for Sella's message to arrive, not a Concord ambush this time, nothing so clean as an enemy with a name and a motive Idris could argue with. She collapsed at school, the guild-issued monitoring bracelet on her wrist, fitted after the apartment incident, meant to alert Idris if she was ever in danger again, flagging a medical emergency instead of a threat. Exhaustion, low blood pressure, a body that had been quietly running on too little sleep and too much fear for 3 weeks while pretending to Idris that she was fine, because she decided somewhere in the last month that being scared out loud would only make things harder for her. System Priority Alert Medical SCLA Vane NON Combat Incident. Idris found her at the guild's medical bay, stable, awake, furious at herself for scaring him over nothing. Priya was the one who'd actually treated her, running the same drain signature readouts she'd once used on Idris's failed training attempts, and the diagnosis she gave Idris privately before he'd even reached Sella's bedside was blunt in a way Priya rarely allowed herself to be with patients' families. Physically, she'll recover in a day or two with rest. But I want you to actually hear this part. Her body's been running on stress hormones for 3 weeks straight, the kind that don't just go away because the immediate danger passes. If this household doesn't find a way to actually rest sometime soon, I'm going to be treating one or both of you for something worse than exhaustion. Priya examined Idris as well, over his mild protest that he wasn't the patient, and found exactly the pattern she'd half expected to find given everything he described about the bond. Elevated fatigue markers consistent with someone who'd been in sustained low-grade combat readiness for 3 weeks straight, a body running on adrenaline reserves it hadn't been given proper time to rebuild between incidents. "You're not dying," she told him with the specific bluntness of a healer who'd decided flattery wasn't going to help either of them. "You're also not fine, whatever you keep telling Holt in roster meetings. Whatever this bond costs both of you, it's not going to announce itself as a crisis until it already is one. I'd rather catch it now while it's still just exhaustion." Bastion visited too, awkwardly, carrying a bag of food from a shop near the guild hall that Sella had mentioned liking exactly once, months earlier, in a conversation he apparently hadn't forgotten even though nobody would have expected him to remember it. "Figured you'd both skip actual meals over this," he said, setting it down without making a production of the gesture, and left again almost as quickly as he'd arrived. A small, unglamorous kindness that told Idris, more clearly than the equipment bay apology had, that Bastion's change of heart wasn't performance for an audience. It was becoming who he actually was around them, one quiet gesture at a time. Sella, for her part, treated her own collapse with the specific frustration of someone who considered her body's limits an inconvenience rather than a legitimate excuse. "I'm fine," she told Idris at least 4 times before he'd even sat down, each repetition a little less convincing than the last until she finally admitted, quietly, the thing she'd apparently been carrying alone since the apartment incident. "I keep replaying it." Not the two people, Vesa handled them in about 4 seconds. "I keep replaying the part before you got there, when it was just me and them and I didn't know if you'd make it in time." Standing at her bedside, registry inquiry pending, Ashclaim Concord regrouping somewhere for a second attempt, his sister pale, and apologizing for a collapse that was entirely his fault for letting her carry 3 weeks of fear alone. Idris finally asked Vesa the question he'd been avoiding since the training hall. "What does it actually cost you?" he said, quiet, not performing the question for anyone but her. "Every time I call you." "What does it cost?" Vesa didn't deflect this time. "The bond runs both directions," she said. "You have felt the cost as fatigue, as the ache after a long manifestation. I have felt it as something closer to what your sister is feeling in that bed. Every call draws on both of us. I did not tell you sooner because you needed to learn to ask before you needed to know the price of asking, and because I did not want you to hesitate at the one moment hesitating would have cost your sister her life. You should have told me." "I should have," Vesa agreed. "I am telling you now." The bond is not free, Idris, and it will not become free no matter how skilled you grow at using it. What it can become, if you let it, is shared, not you spending me, not me spending you, but both of us choosing the cost together, the way you chose it in that doorway without knowing what it was. That is the only version of this that does not end the way it ended for the 6 Bloodkeys the Concord has already taken. Idris sat with that for a long moment, watching his sister's slow, steady breathing in the medical bay's dim evening light, and understood, with a clarity that felt more like grief than realization, exactly how much of the last 3 weeks he'd spent treating Vesa as a resource rather than as someone actually bearing a cost alongside him. "I've been asking you to save people," he said slowly, "and I never once asked what it took out of you to keep doing it." "You asked correctly which was the harder problem to solve first," Vesa said. "You are allowed to have solved the first problem before solving the second. I would rather have a vessel who learned to ask sincerely and is now learning to ask carefully, than one who understood the cost from the beginning and never learned to ask at all. The 6 the Concord took, as far as I know of them, never had the chance to learn either lesson. They were found before they had time to learn anything. Is that what happens if the Concord takes me? You just stop the way Corin stopped." Vesa didn't answer immediately, and the silence told Idris more than an immediate answer would have. "I do not fully know," she said finally. "Extraction was never something any of us survived to describe afterward. What I know is what 200 years of watching pieces of myself vanish has taught me to fear, and I would prefer, Idris, if you allowed me to keep that fear to myself a while longer. Some costs are mine to carry alone, the same way some were yours to carry alone for 3 years before you learned you didn't have to. System, partial Ember Choir, vision, duration unknown. It happened without an invocation, without Idris reaching for anything, sitting at Sella's bedside, exhausted past the point of guarding his own thoughts. He saw, for just a moment, further than Vesa alone had ever shown him. 6 other shapes, dim and scattered, some flickering weakly like a signal, almost lost, one gone entirely dark in a way that made Vesa's presence beside him go very still. 6 bound pieces of the Ember Choir spread across a world that had spent 200 years forgetting they existed, at least one already lost to whatever the Concord's extraction process actually did to what it took. The vision lingered just long enough for Idris to register fragments of each remaining shape before it faded, not full understanding, more like catching a half-second glimpse of 6 different rooms through 6 different keyholes, each one gone before he could focus on more than an impression. One shape burned steady and fierce, wreathed in something that looked, for that half-second, like heat distortion over open flame, bound to someone who felt young, restless, and half-aware of what they carried. Another flickered so faintly Idris almost mistook it for nothing at all, a presence stretched thin across what felt like decades of near silence, as though whoever carried it had spent a lifetime deliberately never asking. A third pulsed in a slow, patient rhythm entirely unlike Vesa's, colder, more deliberate, bound to someone whose bloodline, Idris somehow understood without being told, had known exactly what they carried for generations and had built an entire quiet, guarded life around protecting the secret rather than ever using it. The 6th living piece, the one Vesa's attention lingered on longest before the vision closed, felt different from the rest in a way Idris couldn't immediately name, not weaker, not stronger, but closer, somehow geographically or otherwise, in a way that made Vesa go very still a second time in the same vision, for an entirely different reason than Corin's absence. "That one is nearer than I expected," she said, once the vision fully passed and she could speak again without the strain audible in her voice from a moment ago. "I do not yet know whether that is coincidence, or whether the Concord's recent activity in this region is not coincidental at all." "That was Corin," Vesa said quietly when the vision passed and Idris could speak again. "Bound to a bloodline in the eastern provinces. Taken 4 years ago. I did not know until just now that he was gone. I have carried the hope that he wasn't for 4 years, and I no longer have it to carry. It was the lowest point Idris had touched since his trial marker went the dull gray everyone dismissed. Not the registry inquiry, not the Concord second cell already forming somewhere out past Gray Banner's walls, but the specific grief of an ancient, patient being who just learned in real time, standing beside a 19-year-old she'd chosen 4 seconds and 3 weeks ago, that she'd already lost one of the 6 people she'd spent 2 centuries hoping were still out there. "Then we don't let them take another one," Idris said, and meant it in a way that had nothing left in it of the boy who'd counted 412 failures like a verdict. Starting with us. What starting with us actually meant in practice occupied most of the following 2 days. Holt redrew Gray Banner's entire security posture around the hearing date, correctly guessing that a registry-mandated public event was exactly the kind of fixed, predictable target the Concord's patient, institutional planning would find hard to resist, reinforcing HQ's perimeter, rotating extra strikers onto overnight coverage, quietly moving Sella into a guild-owned residence closer to HQ than the Vane apartment over her initial objection. Until she read the actual threat assessment Holt showed her and stopped objecting. Idris spent those same 2 days doing the harder, less tangible work of actually practicing what Vesa had called sharing the cost, rather than just understanding the phrase intellectually. It meant learning to notice in real time when a manifestation was drawing more from her than either of them could sustain, and choosing, together, the way she'd insisted it had to be chosen to pull back rather than push through. It meant, twice, Idris deliberately ending a training exercise early because Vesa's flicker had started to remind him of the 6 dim, scattered shapes from the vision, and neither of them being willing to risk finding out how close that particular resemblance could get before it stopped being a resemblance. "You are learning the thing that took me 200 years to fully understand myself," Vesa told him near the end of the second day, in a tone that carried something close to genuine warmth underneath its usual ancient patience. That strength shared carefully outlasts strength spent carelessly, every time, across every scale, a single bond or 7. The Concord has never understood this. It is, I suspect, the single largest reason they have survived 2 centuries without ever once succeeding at what they actually claim to want. He said it not knowing Marrow Kest had already stopped treating Gray Banner as one cell's unfinished business. Somewhere past the walls of the medical bay, she was redirecting everything the Concord still had in reserve toward a single address, timed for the one night she'd calculated Gray Banner would be least ready to answer for it, the same night the registry had scheduled Idris's suspension hearing. Part 6, What the Registry Got Wrong ~118 00 ~138 00. System ASHCLAIM Concord Full Deployment Target Gray Banner Company Headquarters. Marrowcast didn't wait for the registry's inquiry to resolve itself before making the Concord's real move. She'd read the registry's caution the same way Idris eventually did, as an opening rather than a threat, and brought a full deployment against Gray Banner's headquarters directly on the night before Idris's formal class suspension hearing, betting correctly that a guild distracted by registry politics would be slower to mount a full defense. She was wrong about exactly one thing: how many people at Gray Banner had decided, over 3 increasingly impossible weeks, that Idris Vane wasn't a liability to be managed anymore. Holt had the roster standing lines before the Concord's first operative cleared the outer perimeter. Bastion fought beside a courtesy slot he'd once refused to trust with his own safety, without hesitation, without needing to be asked twice. Sella, against every direct order to stay in the medical bay, stood at the command post relaying breach data with the same sharp pattern-reading instinct that had cracked Idris's 412 failures weeks earlier, because whatever the Concord had come to take, she decided a long time ago it wasn't happening on her watch either. The Concord's full deployment was nothing like the 6-operative probe at Zone 12D. Marrow committed close to 30 operatives to the assault, split into 3 coordinated waves designed to overwhelm Gray Banner's perimeter before any single defensive line could hold long enough to matter, the first wave testing the outer wards, the second exploiting whatever gaps the first wave's data revealed, the third held in reserve for whatever the first 2 failed to finish. Corin Wyeth held the eastern approach with 2 junior strikers under him. The same uneasy, unconvinced Corin who'd questioned Idris's place on the roster only days earlier, and he held it without hesitation when the moment actually arrived. Not because his doubts had vanished, Idris understood later, but because Holt's answer to those doubts had apparently been enough to settle the only question that mattered in the moment: whose side Corin was actually going to stand on when it counted. He took a wound doing it, a deep cut across his shield arm that would keep him off active deployment for weeks, and didn't fall back until the eastern line was secure enough for a junior striker to hold alone. Bastion ran the western approach, the mirror of his usual highlight reel positioning, except now angled deliberately around covering gaps rather than chasing kills. The same lesson Idris had watched him start learning in the equipment bay weeks earlier, now paying out in real time under real pressure. He took the second wave's opening strike personally, throwing himself into a position that should have cost him badly, and didn't, because Priya had positioned herself close enough to the western line to close the wound before it became a real problem. Her own quiet contribution to a fight nobody had asked a healer to be brave in, but that she'd insisted on regardless. Sella's command post work went beyond simple data relay. 3 minutes into the second wave, she spotted a pattern in the Concord's approach, a deliberate stagger in their attack timing that matched, almost exactly, the same kind of rhythm she'd once cataloged in Idris's failure textures, and flagged it to Holt fast enough for Grey Banner's line to adjust before the third wave's reserve force could exploit the gap it was designed to open. Holt would say afterward in the after-action report that Sella Vane's pattern recognition call was the single largest tactical factor in preventing the assault's third wave from ever fully deploying. A 16-year-old civilian, technically not even supposed to be at the command post, credited formally in a registry-adjacent guild document for the first time in her life. None of it, not Corin's line, not Bastion's covering position, not Sella's pattern call, would have been enough on its own against 30 coordinated Concord operatives. What made the difference, in the end, was the same thing that had made the difference in every engagement since Zone 19B. An entity the Hunter Registry had no box for, standing at the center of a guild that had, over 3 impossible weeks, decided collectively that protecting it was worth everything they had. System, Summoner Class, Invocation, Shared. Idris didn't call Vesa alone this time. He asked the way she taught him, and for the first time since the training hall, he felt her answer not as something arriving from elsewhere, but as something rising with him. The bond Vesa had described at Sella's bedside, chosen together instead of spent one direction, and what stood in Grey Banner's courtyard when the channel opened wasn't a fragment or even the full, steady presence from Zone 12D. It was something closer to what the Ember Choir had actually been 200 years and 1 desperate binding ago, before fear scattered it into 7 pieces nobody was supposed to survive alone. Marokest, watching her second cell fail against something the first hadn't come close to matching, finally showed the crack under 200 years of practiced calm. "This isn't supposed to be possible," she said, and for the first time it didn't sound rehearsed. A Bloodkey doesn't share the bond. The binding doesn't allow it. We built 2 centuries of doctrine on the binding not allowing it. Your doctrine was built by people who took, Vesa said, standing beside Idris in a light that no longer flickered at all. We were never given the chance to be asked in 200 years until this one. You built a containment theory around a version of us that only existed because no one ever tried the alternative. Marrow didn't retreat immediately this time, standing amid a collapsing formation with the specific stillness of someone recalculating 2 centuries of certainty in real time. "If what you're saying is true," she said to Vesa, though her eyes stayed on Idris, "then every extraction the Concord has ever performed was not just unnecessary. It was the exact mistake we believed we were preventing." "Yes," Vesa said without softening it. "And you expect me to simply accept that, on the word of the first Bloodkey in 2 centuries to prove it, in the middle of the operation that was supposed to prove the opposite?" "I expect nothing from you, Overseer," Vesa said. "I have expected nothing from the Concord in 200 years, and I have not once been disappointed by that expectation until tonight." What I am offering you is not a demand. It is the same thing Idris offered me the night I first arrived properly. 413 failed calls into a life the registry had already decided didn't matter. A chance to ask a different question than the one you've been asking for 2 centuries. Idris stepped forward, close enough now that Mero's practiced calm flickered a second time. You told me at Zone 12D that you'd rather not do this the hard way, he said. I'm telling you the same thing now, and I mean it the same way you did. Call off the 3rd wave. Nobody else needs to get hurt proving a point you've already lost. Mero held his gaze for a long moment, long enough that Idris genuinely didn't know until she finally spoke which way the moment was going to break. The 3rd wave was already recalled 2 minutes ago, she said. I gave the order the moment your Bloodkey arrived whole instead of fragmented. I am many things, Mr. Vane, but I am not a fool who commits reserves to a battle already lost. Whether I am capable of being wrong about 200 years of doctrine is a separate question, and one I intend to actually sit with, rather than simply retreat from and pretend I haven't heard. System Hunter Registry, Emergency Oversight Team Arrival. The Registry's actual oversight team arrived in the final minutes of the fight, too late to help and exactly in time to see the truth. Ren Calloway's forged credentials had spent 3 weeks preventing them from finding on their own. An entity the Registry's classification system had no box for, fighting alongside a guild, against an organization with 200 years of off-the-books extraction victims. To protect a headquarters full of people who'd chosen to stand with the Bloodkey they'd almost suspended out of caution instead of understanding. Denna Ockhafer was among the oversight team that arrived, and she was the first to reach Holt amid the wreckage of the outer perimeter. Her earlier hallway promise to make the argument for Idris at the hearing rendered almost moot by the scene in front of her. I don't think we're going to need the hearing anymore, she said, taking in the collapsed Concord formation, the guild roster still holding defensive positions out of habit more than necessity now. Or rather, I think the hearing just happened, and none of us were the ones who needed convincing. You'll still need to file something, Holt said, in the specific exhausted tone of a man who just survived a siege and was already thinking about paperwork anyway, because 11 years of guild command didn't turn off simply because the immediate danger had passed. I'll file the truth, Ockhafer said. A gray banner deployment repelled an organized assault by 30 operatives using forged registry credentials, with 0 guild casualties, thanks to the direct intervention of the class the panel was about to suspend. I don't think that's a difficult report to write, Captain. I think it's the easiest one I've filed in 4 years. The oversight team spent the rest of the night processing the scene, collecting the Concord's abandoned equipment, none of it bearing any identifiable markings, exactly the kind of untraceable gear a 2 centuries-old shadow organization would field, interviewing Gray Banner's roster individually, cross-referencing accounts that all, independently, corroborated the same sequence of events. And quietly, without fanfare, opening the first official registry file in the organization's history with the words Ashclaim Concord in its header. It wasn't a declaration of war against an enemy the registry barely understood yet. It was, Holt would say later, something almost as valuable, the first crack in 2 centuries of the Concord operating entirely in the dark, unacknowledged and therefore unaccountable to anyone at all. Mero Kest didn't stay to explain herself to registry oversight. She retreated the way she'd retreated from Zone 12D, unhurried even in defeat, but the parting words she left weren't for Idris this time. The Concord doesn't stop because one cell fails twice, she said. But I'll admit, Mr. Vane, you've made a better argument for the alternative than any of the 6 we took before you. I hope for both our sakes you're right and I've been wrong for 200 years. System class reclassification, summoner status, superseded. System new classification, CHOIRBOUND, rank, unranked, EXCEDS registry scale. The registry's formal inquiry closed 4 days later, not with a suspension, but with the first class reclassification the Hunter Registry had issued in its documented history. A new category, built specifically because Idris Vane's file no longer fit inside Summoner by any definition the compendium had ever used, dull gray trial marker and all. Holt read the notice out loud in the same roster meeting room where he'd first declared Gray Banner's protection 3 weeks earlier, and this time nobody in the room needed reminding what it meant. Corin Wyeth, arm still bound from the siege, was the one who spoke first once Holt finished reading. "For the record," he said, to the room generally and to Idris specifically, "I asked a hard question 3 weeks ago about what happens if the thing standing beside you ever decides Gray Banner isn't worth protecting. I got my answer at the eastern perimeter 2 nights ago, watching it decide the opposite at cost to itself without being asked twice. I don't have the doubt anymore. I wanted that said out loud, not just implied." Bastion's contribution was smaller and, in its own way, more final than the Equipment Bay apology had been. He simply crossed the room in front of the full assembled roster and offered Idris a handshake with none of the awkwardness that had characterized every interaction between them since Zone 19B. "Ace Striker, courtesy summoner," he said, quiet enough that it wasn't performance for the room, loud enough that Idris understood it was meant to be heard anyway. "Those aren't the roles anymore. Never should have been the roles in the first place. Glad I figured that out before it cost either of us something we couldn't get back." Priya, watching from the back of the room with the particular satisfaction of someone who diagnosed a real problem months before anyone else had a framework for it, caught Idris's eye and simply nodded. The same quiet, undemonstrative confirmation she'd offered since the very first training hall observation about a drained signature that shouldn't have existed. It was, in its own way, the review that mattered most to Idris personally. Not the registry's new classification, not even Holt's formal declaration, but the specific, hard-won respect of the people who'd actually watched him become whoever he was now becoming, one failed and then successful attempt at a time. Idris didn't need the registry's new classification to know what he already understood, standing at Sella's side while she read the notice over his shoulder, grinning in a way she hadn't since before the apartment door was left open for 2 strangers to walk through. The proctor who'd sent him to the farming division's west corridor had been wrong the whole time, not because the system lied, but because the system had never been built to recognize what he actually was, and neither, until 3 weeks of failure and fear and one sister who refused to stop asking better questions than the manual did, had he. Vessa was one of 7. 6 other pieces of the Ember Choir were bound out there besides her, 5 now, with Corin already lost to the Concord, scattered across bloodlines that had never been told what they carried, and an organization 200 years old that wasn't going to stop believing its own doctrine just because one cell lost twice. Vessa had been right about that much. This wasn't an ending. It was the first time in 2 centuries anyone had proven the alternative was possible. That night, once the roster meeting emptied and Gray Banner HQ settled back into something like its ordinary rhythm, Idris found Sella on the same rooftop access point they'd used years earlier on evenings when their parents' absence felt too large for the apartment to hold. She had her notebook with her, out of habit more than necessity now, 311 failure entries, a registry hearing statement, a formal after-action commendation, all filed inside the same battered cover that had once tracked nothing but silence. "What happens now?" she asked, not really a question about logistics, more a question about the shape of a life neither of them had expected to be living a month ago. "I don't know," Idris admitted. 5 more pieces of the Ember Choir are out there. The Concord isn't finished believing what it believes. Whatever comes next, it's not going to be smaller than what we just survived. "Good," Sella said, surprising him. "I spent 3 years watching everyone decide you didn't matter before they'd even properly looked. I'd rather have whatever's coming next than go back to that." He didn't have a clean answer for that either, standing on a rooftop with his sister, an ancient bound presence steady and warm at the edge of his awareness for the first time without needing to be summoned, and a 5-piece scattered inheritance somewhere out in a world that had spent 2 centuries forgetting any of it existed. What he had instead was the thing 412 failures had never quite managed to take from him, however close they'd come. The certainty, finally proven rather than just hoped for, that asking honestly had always been worth more than the registry's gray marker ever gave it credit for. That was enough for now to be the story that got told. CTA-138 00 20. If you want to see what happens when the Concord comes back with everything they held in reserve, and what it means for the 5 choir pieces still out there, that's the part I'm building next. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and drop your rank prediction for Idris in the comments before the next one drops. Outro ~138 20 ~139 00. Idris Vane spent 3 weeks being told his class was worthless by a system that had simply never been built to see him. What actually made him dangerous was never the label, it was the choice to keep asking, honestly, long after 412 failures gave him every reason to stop. That's the part the registry never had a box for either. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one. Script complete, hook plus parts 16 plus CTA outro.